So, hi there. After the short 7-minute introduction into Scrum in general, this presentation will go into a bit more detail and will tell you a bit about how and why use Scrum in game development in specific. So, to start off, what is Scrum? You should already know that from the video. Scrum is a so-called agile process. We'll talk a bit about what agile means, where teams are self-organizing and trying to continuously improve how they work. The idea is that Scrum allows you to deliver the highest value in the shortest time by focusing on always delivering something that is shippable or playable, in our case, in time boxes. That is, other project management tools focus on the individual things that you deliver and then estimate the time. Scrum says you work in a fixed time box and you try to fit something that actually makes the game more playable or makes the game playable within that fixed time box. And then after every time box you have something that actually works, and then you can add to that or you can rework it. So these time boxes are called sprints. They usually work on a cadence of 1 to 4 weeks. You capture the requirements, the stuff that your game is made out of, as user stories in a so-called product backlog, a list of the things, and then every sprint, every time iteration, a product owner, that can be a team or somebody else, prioritizes items from that backlog or adds something to them, like reworking the existing game for that sprint. And then the team disassembles those priorities set by the product owner into actual tasks, estimates how much time each task will take. You then prioritize tasks again until the tasks in their estimated time actually fit the sprint length. And then you track progress of these tasks on a so-called sprint backlog. That's Scrum in a nutshell. I already said Scrum is one of the agile processes. What does that mean? Well, that comes out of software development, the so-called Agile Manifesto, which you can read up on. And basically, this is a statement of certain values that work for software development. It puts individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That is, don't get too focused and bogged down on using the exact language and using the exact tools. The important thing is when people interact frequently with each other, that's the best recipe for actually getting a working team. The second process is you put a fun working game over comprehensive documentation. Lots of software processes, you always produce huge game design documents and other things. The important thing in the end is that you have an actual working game, right? That doesn't mean documentation is unnecessary. It's crucial for communicating in your team, but the purpose is not to produce documentation, but always ask, does this documentation help us make actually a better game? Third principle is you put customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Now, for you in the classroom, that's less of an important principle, but the idea there, if you're working for a client, is that you meet with the client, together with the client, you set priorities, you set how shall this game move forward in the next iteration over negotiating a contract first, and then the client tries to get the most out of you based on that contract. And then fourth, responding to change over following a plan. The idea is, the important thing again is to deliver a valuable, fun game, not necessarily to deliver the game that you initially intended or envisioned, because usually your first vision isn't really good and turns out not to be very fun. Scrum is basically right now the de facto development process in most game companies that I've in, certainly, but also in most of the big ones. Here are just some examples of the big companies, Electronic Arts and so on, that are regularly using Scrum. And that is the case for two connected reasons. The first is Scrum, this working in iterations and producing a shippable product every time, is a great way of reducing risk. And game design in particularly is an area where you have lots of risk, because games are so novel, right? They're not like baking bread, where how to bake bread and how long it takes to bake bread has been settled forever, and it's always going to be the same kind of croissant you're baking. No, games are novel things where you have to figure out what it is you're building and how you're building it to begin with. So how long something takes is very hard to estimate in advance, and you might have lots of plans and ideas that turn out to be completely unachievable. Right? That controller scheme that you had an idea of totally doesn't work, but you only find out about that after already sinking 20 hours into it. So to avoid that issue and deal with that uncertainty, what Scrum allows you to do is always build and test small running parts, right? Instead of saying we're going to build, if you look at the image to the right, this big, huge tanker of a ship, well, no, first let's build a little ship to see whether the idea of building a tanker is actually something that is workable, and only if so, then we commit resources to building that out. Secondly, another thing that makes games hard to predict in terms of effort is that they need integration of art assets, sound, gameplay, technology, etc. And that integration usually has lots of complications that are, again, very hard to predict. So by focusing on always delivering and building something shippable, on integrating everything right away in every time box, you don't run into the issue that with only a week to go, you start thinking about integrating stuff and then you discover it's way too late. The second main reason why Scrum is now the standard process in game development is because games are about making stuff fun, and you don't know whether an idea is fun in advance. You have to playtest the idea. So Scrum allows you to first build something playtestable to see whether it's fun, and then always focus on building and polishing testable gameplay to see whether whatever you add to gameplay increases the fun or not. Because we know fun increases with every iteration and polish. So Scrum, with its 6 increments, allows you to add as many iterations and circles of playtesting and iteration as possible to your project. That leads to the fact, if you look to the right, which is an idealized curve, that in Scrum, in a very short period in time, here that's the agile curve, you get to the maximum possible fun in your game very early on. So you get nailed down what it is that makes your game play fun and how to do it very early on. And then the remainder of the time, you just basically build out what you now already know works. Whereas in a classic waterfall process, right, you also start out building something like a first playable prototype, right, a first playable, that's sort of fun. But then you spend a lot of time in just building a lot of things, building out levels, building out gameplay, without ever knowing or without ever improving the fun of your game. That only happens very late in the QA and polish phase, when you then look at the whole game coming together at all the different components, noticing, shoot, this isn't fun at all. And then you spend the rest of your time doing polish until the game is actually fun. The problem is usually the polish is the phase that gets cut off because it happens so late in the period. Somebody has already determined when you're going to ship your game, or the money runs out. So in a lot of cases in that kind of process, the process by which the game you develop then becomes fun gets cut off, and that way you end up with very mediocre games. So that's the reason why you should do Scrum in game development. Just to give you a practical example, Valve's production process or design process for Half-Life 2, which they themselves labeled playtest as production. One of their insights was art and polish is not a risky resource commitment. It's risky to believe that your gameplay is fun and then develop anything out on that, only to discover later on that the core gameplay or the core level design isn't fun. So what they said is, well, let's develop something that is playable gameplay first, see whether it's fun, iterate on it until it's fun, and then when we know it's fun, then we can tell our art asset production and our polish team to then polish the game into that, because we then know this is going to be a great level. So Valve basically used producing shippable gameplay and playtesting to drive their own production process. In every week to 2 weeks, they created about 50 minutes of gameplay in a very rough form. If you look the images to the right, you just have what's called gray boxing. You have a very basic level where you can just playtest the gameplay itself. Right? They try to do as little as possible in order to be able to assess whether this is fun or not. Then they playtested it, and they used the playtesting results to prioritize work for the next week. So to say, okay, this level doesn't work in playtesting. Why doesn't it work? Well, because there is a choke point in gameplay, or well, because the enemy is actually moving way too slow, or well, for any other reasons, or game feel isn't really fun, right? The way you control your character isn't fun. So whatever came out of playtests set the natural priorities for the next iteration. And they did that so long until playtesting was no longer painful to watch. That's their words. And then they said, okay, this level is done, or this piece of core gameplay is done. Now we can move on to the next one. If you want to learn more about that, there's a great talk on GDC Vault, freely accessible. Just go to gdcvault.com and look for Valve's design process for creating Half-Life 2. It's a presentation you can download, and then you can also listen to an audio. Unfortunately, they don't have a video.